then Harishji, we had a wonderful 2 sessions in the morning.
You want
One
to rub
on-
it? You want to rub it?
well, you said you can't be here in the morning, so I have to let it go.
Right.
So, um, I won't go into that. All of you know that we talked about what the art of translation means, and we had 4 wonderful speakers who all talked about why they translate, why they, what is it, how they choose things to translate, and so on. Then there was a really wonderful panel put together by Urvashi and Shibani Phukan on translating the Northeast. So that is where we ran late and we could break up only around 2 o'clock. So sorry about that. And now I hand over the mic to Aditi after I have introduced her. Where is the sorry. Well, Aditi is Vani. So I don't really have to say much more than that. And I was hoping that her father would be able to come briefly because it's a very long standing association that I've had and the book review has had with Arunji. Aditi Maheshwari Goyal is the CEO of the Vani Prakashan Group, which represents the legacy literary list of Vani Prakashan, Bharatiya Gyanpeeth, and Yatra books. She is also the managing trustee at Vani Foundation, the not-for-profit arm of the group. Vani Foundation established the Vani Foundation Distinguished Translator Award at the Jaipur Bookmark, Jaipur Lit Fest. Goel is one of the founding members of the Jaipur Bookmark, South Asia's largest B2B publishing platform at Jaipur Literature Festival. A postgraduate in uh, English literature from Hansraj College, University of Delhi, she was conferred with the National Achievers Award for Literary Entrepreneurship by Z Media. So over to Aditi, and here's to a wonderful afternoon talking about Hindi, uh, Urdu, and Punjabi.
Thank you. Namaskar, everyone. Respected Chandra ji, Trivedi ji, Hina ji, Anamika ji, Bismillah ji, Mrinal ji, Ira ji, Sukrita ji, Rahman Saab, Maya ji, Gautam ji, and our fellow translators. This session is a literature festival on its own.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yes, of course.
I really love that.
This is an august gathering of translators for whom words like experienced is a disservice. They have created the building blocks of the Academy of Indian Literary Translations and have nurtured it with mentorship and generous exchanges. I'm very grateful to TBR for this day. To set the context of this session, in the Indian context, the translation is not merely a linguistic transaction, it is an act of dwelling in the thresholds. The translator stands in a liminal corridor between languages and that are themselves ancient, layered, and internally plural. To translate in India is to negotiate not only between words but between cosmologies, caste inflected idioms, oral cadicences, regional memories, and histories of power sedimented in script and sound. The craft of translation here is therefore a practice of inhabiting the in between, of consenting to uncertainty while shaping it into a meaning. As a publisher and an editor of translated texts, I find my home in this liminal corridor. India's multilingual reality ensures that no language is self contained. Sanskrit breathes within Hindi, Persian has footprints etched onto Urdu, Tamil carries echoes of Sangam landscapes, Bangla remembers Vaishnav lyricism and East Bengali tehzeeb and colonial modernity. Every utterance bears genealogies that have voices in the margins and of them. When the translator approaches a text, say a bhakti poem or a modern Dalit autobiography or a story of a little boy who is sexually abused by a male relative, she does not encounter a stable original but a vibrating field of intertexts. The so called source is already porous. Translation becomes less an act of transfer than a continuation of a long conversation across the tongues. It is this liminal corridor, fidelity, in which fidelity is not about obedience but exertion of the self and negotiation of the reality that is lived and experienced. The translator must decide what to carry across and what to let. Consider untranslatable words like dharma, izzat, virah, anubhav, etc. To flatten them into approximate English equivalents is to risk erasure. To leave them untranslated is to estrange the reader. There is a constriction in context. For example, Vyutpatti Nimittaha and Pravritti Nimittaha are important vantage points to understand the epistemology and ontology of the Vedic frameworks. But they get implied as arbitrary relationships between the words and meanings until, of course, Saussure postulated that in fact it is the signifier and the signified that create all meanings in the world. Further postulations by Julia Kristeva take the argument deeper to the realms of taboo and unintended, but that is for later. The translator therefore crafts a middle path, perhaps through contextual resonance, rhythmic compensation, or subtle annotation, so that the world arrives not as a fossil but as a living, breathing human being. She negotiates between domestication and defamiliarization, between hospitality and resistance. The Indian context further complicates this craft through its layered histories of colonization. English is, as a literary language in India, carries both prestige and violence. Translating from the national languages into English may promise wider readership, yet it also risks subsuming local textures into global smoothness. This global smoothness is actually what we consider in some parts of our worlds as bulldozering of the contexts. The translator must therefore remain alert to asymmetries of power, to preserve dialect, caste marked speech. Regional syntax within English can be political act of perseverance, an insistence that the receiving language stretch, even strutter, to accommodate the difference. In this way, translation becomes an ethical intervention that we all stand up for. Equally significant is the orality embedded in the Indian literary traditions. Folk epics, devotional songs, and performative storytelling rely on rhythm, repetition, and communal memory. The translator must recreate not only the semantic meaning but also the performative energy. She listens for the breath, for the drumbeat, for silences. She recognizes that translation is an embodied craft, attentive to categories as much as to the lexicon. The liminal corridor here is acoustic, a space where one language's music must find an echo in another's tonal architecture. Yet this negotiation is not solely between the languages, it is also within the translator herself. Awful multilingual, she carries her own shifting affiliations. Her choices are shaped by her histories of reading, by her social location, by political commitments. Translation India is therefore very reflexive. The translator becomes aware that she is not invisible or implicated. The liminal corridor is also her mirror. Ultimately, the craft of translation in the Indian context is an art of responsible trespassing. We all are proud gate crashers into the parties of knowledge and expression that have non binary or very sordid gatekeepers. We feel very sorry for them. We cross borders while acknowledging them. We accept that no translation is final, that each version is provisional. It is a bridge that trembles yet serves its purpose as a passage. In negotiating the threshold between languages, the translator does not resolve differences. She sustains it, makes it their own. And in sustaining it, she affirms the plurality that defines the Indian literary imagination. The poetics, politics, strategy, sales, marketing, and social assimilation of translation are therefore the broad themes of the day. The structure of this discussion would allow 10 to 12 minutes to each speaker. Since Ashok Vajpayee ji could not join us this afternoon, we have his time to be equally distributed amongst all of us. And there will be a coffee break at 4 o'clock, as Chandraji rightfully tells us. So to start this discussion, I now first request respected Ira Pande ji, who's taught English literature at Punjab University in Chandigarh for about 14 years. On relocating to Delhi in 1990, she worked in the Indian Express and later shifted to the journal Seminar. She was the chief editor of Biblio, a journal of book reviews, for some time before she joined the Doling Kinderslays and worked on travel guides and illustrated knowledge books. She also served as a chief editor at Rowley Books and ended her working life as an editor and publisher as the chief editor of the India International Center's Publication Division, where she edited several volumes that were widely read. Ma'am, we think you started a new life after this. For the last 10 years or so, she has devoted herself to translation and won the Crossword and the Sahitya Academy Award for her translations of Manohar Shyam Joshi's Tata Professor in 2010. In addition, she wrote a widely read memoir of her mother, the late legendary author Shivani, titled Didi, My Mother's Voice, in English, which she later translated into Hindi. In addition, she has translated Shivani's Apradhini, Women Without Men, Prabha Khetan's autobiography from the Hindi original Anya Se Ananya into English as a life apart. She was awarded the translation prize for her translation of Shivani's Amadar Shanti Niketan, Amadar Shanti Niketan by the Value of Words in 2022. Her latest work is translation of Yatin Mishra's autobiography, authoritative biography of Lata Mangeshkar's life and times, called Lata Surgatha, from Hindi into English. Ma'am, welcome.
Thank you, Aditi. I hardly recognize myself in that huge list of things that you have. I was a very late entrant into the world of translation, and I never thought I had it in me because even though my Hindi was reasonably good, having grown up in a house which had many eminent Hindi speakers and writers, I was always considered a kind of Kiranti, because I went to a convent school. I read books in English more than I read books in Hindi. And so I was very, how shall I say, diffident about my own self. It's only when I came to Punjab and I realized, oh, my Hindi is very good, because there I was exposed to Punjabi. And I taught at the Punjab University, which was an experience of its own kind. I enjoyed myself thoroughly. I taught English literature, but most of my students were people from Punjab. And slowly I realized that my very nice Avadhi and UP Hindi was acquiring a new tinge, and I'd stopped wincing if somebody said, "Aap kahan ja rahe ho?" I was so unaccustomed to hearing that kind of Hindi. Then I remember my mother had come once to our house in Chandigarh, and our sabzi wala was with his thela. He was going across the road. Bataon le lo, ghiya le lo, peh le lo. And so my mother said, "Ye kaun hai?" I said, "Ye sabzi wala hai hamara." She said, "Ye bech kya raha hai? Main jaake dekhti hu." And he was from UP. So she asked him कि तुम कहाँ के हो? बोला कि जी मैं ऊपी का हूँ. So she said, तुम्हें शर्म नहीं आती यूपी के हो के तुम ये हाथ लगाते हो? तुम मेरे लखनऊ आओ, मैं तुमको सिखाती हूँ हिंदी कैसे बोली जाती है। मेरा फल वाला आता है, वो कहता है बहू जी केला नहीं हाथी का दांत है, ये अमरूद नहीं हसीना का गाल है। सो शी से जिसको नहीं खरीदना होता है वो भी आके खरीदता है। सो दैट वाज यू नो अ रियलिटी चेक ऑन what I was descending into, and I thought I must start reading good Hindi in order to educate myself about what Hindi really is. We just took it for granted that Hindi was some background noise because घर पे हम लोग कुमाऊनी बोलते थे. We always spoke Kumauni or English. I mean, those were the two go-to languages. Anyhow, this is by way of an introduction to say that we are sometimes so unaware of what we have allowed ourselves to forget in the process of acquiring new skills, new languages, new friends, new places. And all these things are somewhere buried very deeply into one's memory. I've always looked upon translation as a calling. It was something that I realized that I could bring to translating from Hindi into English, a quality which perhaps was enriched by my exposure to other languages also. And all the various nuances of Allahabad में अलग किस्म की हिंदी बोली जाती थी, region wise गाने होते हैं, फोक सॉन्ग्स होते हैं, जो हमारे घर में काम करते थे, उनकी जो भाषा थी कितनी एक्सप्रेसिव थी. And even though it seemed very rough to us, there was an earthiness which was completely lacking in the kind of Hindi that we spoke amongst each other. एक और लतीफ़ा आपको मैं सुनाती हूँ, just to bring into focus what I'm trying to say, is that Sunil Gangopadhyay was once asked by somebody, saying कि जब रे ने आपकी चौरंगी पे फिल्म बनाई, तो were you happy with it? He said, yes, it was a good enough film. So he said, but wasn't there some things that he had deliberately, reworked and things? So Gangopadhyay ji told him कि देखो, जब लड़की की शादी होती है तो उसका गोत्र बदल जाता है. And जब मेरे नॉवल की उन्होंने फिल्म बनाई तो उसका गोत्र बदल गया. और आपका दामाद चाहे कितना ही खराब हो, आप पब्लिकली उसकी कभी बुराई नहीं करेंगे. So, I've kept these things in my head that when you are translating from one language to another, the gotra changes, but somewhere you do not mess around with somebody else's work. And 3, that you should never try and own that voice. That voice is somebody else's. When I was doing Manohar Shyam Joshi's Tata Professor, he had the most magnificent ear for various languages. वो बम्बईया हिंदी भी लिखते थे, बरेली की जो वहाँ की तू तड़ा की लैंग्वेज होती है वो भी करते थे, कुमाऊँ की तो खैर he wrote his whole kasab is entirely based on his Kumauni. And because I'm a Kumauni myself, and when I started translating Tata Professor, I realized that there are certain things which even if I want to own them, I cannot, because they are somebody else's language. It's like you're inheriting or you're adopting a child, you bring him up or her up as your own, but the parents, the biological parents, will always be somebody else's. So these are the things which I keep in my head when I translate. The other thing is I don't like to ever, how shall I say, be persuaded to do a translation which I haven't myself chosen. Because your own choice dictates to you the quality of the translation that you're going to do. I have done 1 or 2, and I'm never very happy with the ones which I've done either for friends or because I was persuaded by somebody to do it. Your own judgment gets flawed. Aditi spoke about how languages have so many, how shall I say, sounds and memories. And in Kumauni, for instance, just as Eskimos have, I think, 60 words to describe snow, depending on the texture of the snow, In Kumaon, we have smells, you know, because हर तरह की बदबू या खुशबू की उसमें now how do I translate that into English? भीगे कुत्ते की बास, या पोचे की बास, या जब बाल आग में गिर जाए उसकी बास. Now these are all very refined olfactory divisions, which and Joshi ji was a master at doing all this. So you have to understand how you can use that, because English is such a flat linear language. Even the modes of address are, it's a flat U for everyone. Whereas all of us who speak Indian languages know that when you're speaking to somebody older, your voice, you never shout at somebody older, it is always modulated. So, the registers are very different. You have to be very sensitive of how to use those registers. And the last point I want to make is that fiction and non-fiction are two completely different categories. It is much easier to translate non-fiction, easier in the sense that, you have control over the text. Non-fiction is difficult because especially where direct speech is concerned. And here I feel that no matter how competently some non-Indian translator has translated a book which may have won some very important award, as Harish once pointed out, Ret Samadhi, Gitanjali's book, was translated as Tomb of Sand by Daisy Rockwell. Now, Samadhi is not just a tomb. Samadhi is also an act of meditation. It's an inward journey. That somehow got hidden behind, that word Samadhi. I was recently reading somebody's autobiography, translated by his own daughter, by the way, called Mere Hisse Ki Roshni, Roshnai, sorry. And she had translated it as my slice of light. Roshnai is ink, not light. And the whole sort of universe changes when you do that. So these are just one or two that I can think of, but there are so many other ways in which you can distort the spirit of a book if you are not sensitive, and if you are you're sort of bulldozing, or if you're looking for only gender or Dalit literature, or bhai kitab, a good book should speak to you rather than you're speaking to the book. So that is what I have learned in my journey as a translator. I'm willing to be corrected on many of my my values and things, but I can't give them up. That is who I am.
Thank you so much, Iraji. Memory as a register, translation as a register of memory. That's what we take from you. Thank you. I next invite Gautam Choubey, who is a Delhi-based novelist and translator, and formerly the host of Likhawat, Sansad TV's talk show on Indian literature. He has translated prose fiction of Suryakant Tripathi Nirala's A Portrait of Love, that is published by Penguin, and Andre Bettel's Loktantra aur uski Sansthaएं. And he has also co-translated Hindi bestseller 12th Fail. His translation of Pandey Kapil's historical romance Phul Sungi is the first ever translation of Bhojpuri novel into English. His recent Hindi novel Chakka Jam, set against the JP movement, won the Kalinga Award for the best book and Shiv Kumar Shiv Smriti Samman. Gautam teaches English literature at ARSD College, University of Delhi. Welcome, Gautam.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Ma'am mentioned a point that it's very difficult for translators to own certain things, but something very strange happened when I translated Nirala, and when the translator's copy came, it was addressed to Mrs. Suryakant Tripathi Nirala. The address was mine, so some kinship there. I'll speak, as we discussed, on my experience of translating Bhojpuri and the difficulties and what lies ahead in Bhojpuri translation. The novel that I translated, Phul Sungi, came out in 2019. And that was the time when Bihar was going to election. So there was a national interest in anything that emerges from Bihar. And it turned out that the book was well received, and it also opened up possibilities for other books to emerge from Bihar, that is, to put incorrectly, Bihari languages. So, for example, a friend who was struggling to find a publisher for his Maithili translation of Hari Mohan Jha's Kanyadan Lalit, he managed two publishers. Soon afterwards, Abhay K, he brought out the book of Bihari literature, and then he also translated Phool Bahadur by Surikant Pati, Jaykant Pati, yeah. So 3 books came out in quick succession, and there was also this surge of demand. Publishers would call me up and ask, what is the next work, what is the next book? But then, as Harish sir pointed out in one of his articles, is what next is a difficult question to answer, because the first translation has that novelty factor. You know, it's the first ever translation, the first book to be translated from Maithili, the first Magadhi novel ever written to be translated. So once that novelty wears off, where do you take it from there? How to find the next book worthy of translation? And that leads me to the question of Bhojpuri canon. You know, when I think of the Bhojpuri canon, and when you ask me, if anyone asks me what are the top 10 Bhojpuri novels that you believe are fit for translation after Fulzungi, I can count up to 5, but no further, because there's no sense of a canon as such. As to why there is no canon, one reason could be the absence of an updated history of Bhojpuri literature. Though there have been histories of Bhojpuri literature, but the one that came in English, and the only one that came in English, came out in 1960 as an Asiatic Society monologue, published from Calcutta by Uday Narayan Tiwari. And it was his PhD thesis. It wasn't a book that he wanted to write. So, and the thesis focused largely on grammar, and it ended up being a survey of Bhojpuri grammar, its syntax, and very less on literature. So whatever literary developments we saw after independence, that part it overlooks. It does talk about very briefly about Mahendra Shastri and a couple of other writers, Avadhi Suman, who were writing back then and writing good prose, but it largely leaves out the writers that have emerged after independence, and the Bhojpuri, the strength that Bhojpuri movement has garnered after independence. So there's no account of that. Then the other authoritative history of Bhojpuri literature is by a person called Krishnadev Upadhyay. And Upadhyay ji, arguing after, I remember reading his preface, Suniti Kumar Chatterjee, says that Bhojpuri is a folk language. So if in the classification, you have nearly 2/5 of the book dedicated to Sant Sahitya, then there is Lok Sahitya, and then there is a smattering of Adhunik Sahitya. Viveki Rai has done some recent work, good work on getting attention to Bhojpuri prose. But if you set aside these 3 books, the other books are essentially a repetition of what Uday Narayanji and Krishnadev Upadhyay have written. There's very little to know as to what to read in Bhojpuri. When you speak of the Sant Sahitya, yes, there is Dharni Das, Lakshmi Sakhi, and there are all these traditions. But there's no reference, or there's no detailed or chronological attempt at looking at the prose that is emerging in Bhojpuri. So that is one problem. How to tell the publisher what next. That's a difficult question to answer. The other problem with canon formation is canon formation and such exercises, as Sir would know, takes place in university spaces, and it is taught but at 2 universities in the country, both in Bihar, and it's taught at the postgraduate level. So beyond a working syllabus, there is really no attempt at classifying or developing a syllabus or a very robust research program. Authors slip in and out of syllabus. Authors slip in and out of recognition. And that happens when there is a syllabi and it is revised periodically. But when there is one syllabi that has been there forever and has not been revised at all, there's little room for new authors to emerge. So that is the other problem with Bhojpuri canon and not knowing what to translate next. And because there are no universities where this is taught, very few, 2 rather, there are no academic appointments, there is no library purchase. So the Bhojpuri books that circulate, they circulate largely among reading space, there's no institutional space for the circulation of Bhojpuri books. So that is one problem that Bhojpuri literary world had to deal with. It was sustained, and I go around talking about Bhojpuri, and I feel that you know, when you have a huge audience and half of the people are disinterested, and yet they feel the urge to ask a question, they would stand up and say, "Well, what about obscenity?" Now that discourse has drowned out, what is happening in Bhojpuri. There's so much happening in Bhojpuri within Bihar, confined to the province, to the geographical limits of the province. But there's a lot happening, which all get drowned out because of this larger debate on obscenity, on politics, and things like that. So, and this might be a politically incorrect thing to say, but um, in my sense, I'm trying to put together an anthology of Bhojpuri short stories, probably the best short stories. Okay, let's not get into that. But my sense is there is no tradition of criticism in Bhojpuri. There was an attempt made in the 1960s. There was an association called Bhojpuri Sansad, which operated out of Varanasi, and Varanasi being a university town. They brought out this journal called Kasauti, spelled in Bhojpuri as Kasauti. So Kasauti was responsible for developing some kind of a tradition of criticism, and that over the decades would have blossomed into a strong canon for me to choose from and for other translators to choose from, but that didn't happen. So it turns out that the overarching um, parameter of criticism, or even determining what text is worthy of translation, is caste. Now, I'll probably conclude with an example that I faced and an experience that I had. I translated Fulsungi, which is by Pande Kapil. Pande Kapil is not Kapil Pande. So Pande Kapil is a Kayast. And the story of Fulsungi is about this folk poet Mahendra Mishra and a courtesan from Muzaffarpur, Dhelabai, who was abducted by a landlord based in Chhapra, Halwan Sahai. So this is by a Kayast, and my surname is Choubey, so there's a problem. I was told by fellow Choubeys that you could have chosen somebody else because there are many versions of the story. One version of the story is by another Pandey. It's called Mahendra Mishra quite literally, and he said people told me that you should have chosen that. There's yet another version of the story by Zohar Safi Abadi. People told me you should not have even thought of translating it. It's not even worth contempt given a thought. Another version in Hindi, Anamika ma'am has done, Das Dware Ka Pinjra. Author Sanjeev has a version of the story in Purvi Bayar. So there are all these versions. And so if there is a canon in Bhojpuri, that canon is determined largely by caste. And the other concern, again linked to this question of caste, is a cultural hero. So it seems that the Bhojpuri world at the moment is divided between two cultural heroes. So on the one hand, you have Mahendra Mishra, whose stories are told and retold in these various books, in Fulsungi, in Mahendra Mishra, in Purvi Ke Dha, in Purvi Bayar, in Das Dware Ka Pinjra. And on the other hand, there is Bhikhari Thakur. So unless you can find a third cultural hero, it's very difficult to expand that canon, So I'll leave you with a set of problems because as of now, these problems appear difficult for me to resolve. Maybe a decade from now, more translators would be around and we could have a whole panel on Bhojpuri, the way we had on Northeast early in the morning. But yeah, I'll leave you with those questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you for holding up a case for Bhojpuri. And of course, the absence is much more grave because there is no woman towering figure also that coming up. And although we are going to have another round of question answer, but we'll come back to you for your experience of talking about literary works in translation on mass media. That is also an important point that we'd like to. Now, coming to Sukrita Janab. she's a Janab for me. Sukrita Malika. Sorry, Janab. No. Just a second.
That is safer.
My bad, really.
It's not done session-wise, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Bad.
Oh. She needs no introduction yet. Born and brought up in Kenya, was a former fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. She held the prestigious Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at Delhi University, an honorary faculty at Corfu, Greece. She was an invited resident poet at the prestigious International Writing Program at Iowa, USA. Her most recent collections of poems, The Yellow Salt and Amp, Pepper Selected Poems, and Vanishing Words and Dreamcatcher, are very popular and are in circulation. Sukrita was awarded Rabindranath Tagore Prize in 2024, and in 2022 she was honored with Vishwaranga Samman and the Bharat Nirman Award earlier. Her poems have been translated into many Indian and foreign languages. The latest are two books of her poems translated into Italian and Japanese, published by Besamushai and Junpa in Tokyo. The book of her poems translated into Tamil is forthcoming. Her critical works include Narrating Partition and The New Story. She has co edited many books, including Speaking for Herself, Asian Women's Writing, and Rivers of Thirst. She was director at Katha's Teaching Translation Program, an honorary fellow at HK Baptist University, Hong Kong. She has published many translations and has held exhibitions of her paintings. Currently, she is a series co editor of Writer in Context with Routledge. And she is also the guest editor of the Indian Literature journal published by Sahitya Academy, India. Over to you.
Thank you, Aditi. Thank you, the book review, which actually means right now Chandra, you're present here. I think these are very useful glimpses into various aspects of translation and translation studies in terms of the fact, particularly in the context of the fact that we don't have even now too many universities which have actually taken on translation in a big way in the teaching of translation as well as translation studies. However, since of late I have been very deeply involved with the editing of Indian literature. I'm saying deeply involved only because I think I'm able to get those flashes where I feel, okay, this is an issue that has to happen. This is a special issue that I have to do. And I have with recently two issues came up. I had planned one on oral traditions, and I ended up getting so much material when we normally say that there is dearth of material on this, particularly in English. But I ended up getting so much material that I had to have two issues on this subject. And there a little background into that, why I'm talking about oral traditions, and then in that context, translation and the symbiotic kind of a relation between the written and the oral, which I think to me is very, very significant. And before I carry on, I was just thinking, two of my very favorite women writers, Krishna Sopti and Ismat Chugtai, and on whom I have worked, and I've had two volumes, one each on the authors I mentioned. One of the things that both of them seem to share in a very big way is how they use the spoken word in the written, you know. And Krishnaji, of course, very often talked about how sounds matter and how why is it that she wrote in the middle of the night when everybody was asleep? Because from within she would get those sounds, you know, which are used in the drawing room or in the dining room, and the vocabulary would come very easily then, whatever she would choose to write on. So much so that even the 4 volumes that she did in the voice of the male character, Hum Hashmat, even that, she said it came to me literally when I was in the middle of the night trying to write in my own female, so-called womanly voice, though she never believed in womanliness. But she said that, I actually felt that I was holding the pen as Hashmat would hold. My handwriting changed. The sounds in my head changed. So I knew that I had to become Hum Hashmat बनना पड़ेगा ये लिखने के लिए. And she started writing in that voice, and she has 4 volumes in that. And what I'm saying is that the sound of the word mattered to her in terms of motivating her to write the drama of life, as it were. So the sounds of the words that she would hear. And so that was my first struck with the whole idea of the oral in one sense, as to how the oral gets written into the written literature. And there is a kind of a give and take between the oral and the written in that context. And Ismat Chugtai also we know, I mean, all her vocabulary and dialogues came from within as Begumati Zuban, in that Zuban. And what was that Zuban which she actually copied from her own experience? She took that language from her aunts, old aunts and grandmothers. It was a joint family, and they would sit in the courtyard when the men folk would have gone for work. Then she would sit in the courtyard. She would not be allowed to. She was a child. So she would not be allowed to be there because there would be gossiping and there would be scandal mongering that would happen. And they would enjoy doing all that. And that is the language which is very colorful. And a lot of exaggeration happens, it's very colorful. So she said that I picked up all my language from there. And how would I listen to it? By getting under the bed where they would be sitting. And sometimes it was difficult, But she would stand behind the doors and all of that. And of course, Azim Beg Chutai, her brother, would forbid her from using that language. However, she managed to conceal writing all her writings, and then eventually become more famous than the brother, who was also a writer. So from that point onwards, working on them, and then I did a book for Delhi University, which was called Cultural Diversity, Linguistic Plurality, etc. It just goes on, the title goes on, and literary traditions in India. And each word I thought was important in terms of having this title. And when I was working on this and at the concept level, I did not want to leave out the oral traditions here. I thought this cultural diversity is best demonstrated through the specific literary articulations, and I'm emphasizing literary in terms of being aesthetically very satisfying in the oral traditions one has. So how can one obliterate that from the study? So that's when I started working and putting these things together along with two of my colleagues, and we put this whole issue together in which we do have Amir Khusro, and many other, Sufi saints and so on, and vachanas were included in this, so that, by force, per force, English departments at that time, Harish, you remember, where there was a total boycott with Indian literature and all of that. And I remember people then found it very difficult to teach this text initially. So I had to struggle very hard to conduct workshops and all of those things. And I was myself giving the workshop to myself because it was my first time doing this kind of work. However, I'm very glad that today, in today's context, and this has been in circulation for, I think, about 12 years or so. So now people are researching. English departments are working on all this, which is wonderful. So from that point onwards to doing a book with Sahitya Academy, this was Chamba a Chamba. Hina, you were part of that team, and so was Bala, of course, and many others from Delhi University. We went to Chamba and Barmore to collect tales, oral tales of, and we thought it would be best to go to old women like now I am, so to tell the tale. And so we would pull those tales out from them, and we put that together, translated them. And because they were oral tales, the translation was very tough. So that was my first venture into translating, not only the tales, but also the songs. And that's where I constantly wanted to hear. I know Hina worked on it on her own at one point of time on translating the songs. We were not satisfied, remember? Then we got hold of a Chambyali person, Priya Sharma, who we discovered teaches in Dayal Singh College and knew Chambyali very well. So we sat down with her and we did collaborative translation, redid the translations, and finally about 60 or 70 songs are there in that book called Chamba a Chamba, which was published by Sahitya Academy. Now, with all that background and dipping into oral traditions here and there, I come to a point when I become the editor of Indian literature, and I say to myself, why don't we have oral traditions represented here. And so I started scouting around for material and finally discovered that whether it was to do with Dastan Goi or it was to do with many other traditions from all over the country. We heard about Northeast and how much of oral traditions are practiced out there and elsewhere. We put it all together, and now these two issues have come out, and I really urge everybody to actually go into them, And the whole country has been covered. We have mapped the entire country and pushed people to give us material. Some of it came on its own volition, etc. So we have it all here. But then I am now beginning to wonder, is it really useful to put the oral into the written and make it a fixed text? Because once it's printed, what happens to that beautiful sound element and all of that, Now, I think as we are getting deeper into this whole issue, and I do believe that we should not denigrate this to the margins, like the Britishers did to folk literature. It was all, in India, whether there was English department obviously would not take it up, but even otherwise, there would be folk traditions being taught in a very marginalized way, folk literature, and people would just think of it as something very exotic and not do anything with it, not really work with very limited number of people doing it. And so it was marginalized and not taken, very seriously. So now I think we should graduate as academic people to integrate oral traditions with the mainstream. And now that we have the technology, audio, visual, etc., instead of the written, we could actually take on the audio-visual recordings and build up our theoretical knowledge on how to understand this kind of aesthetics and so on. There is some that has already been done, and some of it is being represented here. Udayan Vajpayee wrote an article for me, and also there's another person, Raju Nayak from the south. He did a very beautiful article for me for the southern areas, so that, we know that there are some people working isolatedly here and there. And I think if we put our minds together, we will see that the one that we would be conserving more languages that way, because English can play a very subversive role. We do it in English, but by giving knowledge in English to the entire country, make people go to the original finally, And this happens, and we know to read Ghalib, people learn Urdu. So similarly, to understand some oral traditions, I think those languages would be accessed locally by different people. And I think it's very important to conserve the local and not make it global, right? So to preserve those differences and realize the beauty and the bountiful of diversity that we have, I think we need to do all this. And I'm saying this to myself as an academic, as a person involved in literature, and to me literature does mean the coming together of the oral and the written. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukrita ji. Chandra ji and I had secretly thought that we'll give a best panelist award to the person who keeps the clock. We're going to have a very tough competition. Everybody is keeping the clock. Thank you so much.
If you don't mind, just one example, I brought it here.
Yes.
About 10 years ago, I was at Iowa, and I can now take one more minute? All right. So this was in the context of, somebody, a Palestinian poet actually, came and read a poem called Laila Majnu, right? And that person's, I could see the power of the original in the poem, but the translation was not good, English. So I just felt like, trying my hand at it. So I don't know Arabic, but I sat with him all night. We worked on the translation. And he liked the translation. Everybody else also thought it was quite good. That English translation he published somewhere in Europe. It was picked up by a German person who translated it into German. And that German translation was picked up by a musician who actually did the notation and sent me a copy of this book booklet rather, which has Amir Khusro's painting on the cover, which is Laila Majnu, and then it has the Arabic translation, not translation, the original Palestinian poets. And then it has the English translation by me, the German translation, and 20 pages of the notation, music notation. So I think this is what magic of translation can do, right? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this with us. You got the brownie point for that. I now request respected Mrinal Pande ji, who is a veteran journalist, television personality, and an author. She was the first woman editor-in-chief of the multi-edition Hindi daily Hindustan, the first woman to be the Secretary General of the Editors Guild of India. She is also the founder president of the Indian Women's Press Corps, a national body of India's women journalists. She was the chairperson of India's public broadcaster, Prasar Bharati, from April 2010 to March 2014. She was awarded the Padma Shri in 2006 for her services in the field of journalism. Ma'am, most welcome.
Thank you. I'm audible to everybody. I have a bad throat, so I'm a little wary of my voice. I'm basically a writer, but not a good translator. I come to translation out of, let's say, greed and a desire to understand how the mechanics of language work so that I can use it in my own writing. So initially I started by going to Hindi. I write mostly in Hindi. So I started going to Hindi poetry for my own understanding of how language is gelled together, how it is welded together by various poets, and how the same words in prose have a different, very different ring from the one that they acquire when they are knitted into poetry. And I really discovered, I'd been writing and publishing for some time, but around 76, I discovered that there was a whole new world of language and whole new layers to all languages, which really needed to be touched. It was like being in a carpenter's workshop. You opened up everything and then you found that nothing was useless. Everything had a use. Even the burada had some use. Even the slivers of wood had some use. So that gave you a lot of rough material to work with. Of course, themes and stories and tales and folklores, all these you carry within. But then when you put it into words, the various problems that the other professional translators discovered about retaining the resonance of the original to the extent it is possible, and also to be able to say it like the original person would have liked you to say it. And this you cannot achieve unless you really, like you take apart a toy to learn how a toy functions. Then you try to put it together. You may fail, but then you may succeed. So that was my introduction to the world of translation. Then came the emergency, and the emergency was lifted. And that was the time when I was doing all this. And it was just perchance that I met a lot of poets who had been writing underground during the emergency. And Dr. Anant Murthy and my friend Shrikant Verma and a few of us got together and we said that this poetry must be anthologized. So Shrikant Verma collected a whole lot of Hindi poetry that was written, and Dr. Anant Murthy, of course, took upon himself to discover poetry written at the same time down south, and the Hindi poetry landed in my lab, and they said, you translate the ones that you can, and we need to have an anthology brought out. And so I was doing this, and it was very fresh because the emergency had just been lifted, and those of us who had lived through it had seen it from various aspects. I had seen it as a bureaucrat's wife, also as a Hindi writer, also as somebody who was working in a lowly Hindi language news agency, and also as somebody who knew some of the dramatis personae. So when I read these poems, all of a sudden I began to see everything. It was like a refraction. I was initially very confused and shocked, but at the same time, it was like suddenly like a diamond beginning to radiate light to me what emergency actually was, how a sensitive poet's mind saw it. So I think I sat and translated something like 2 dozen, 3 dozen Hindi poems by various poets who wrote, starting with Bhavani Prasad Mishra. He later brought out a whole anthology of his own called Buni Virasi. And this anthology was put together largely by the hard work done by Dr. Anant Murthy, because Shrikant Verma was an excellent poet but bone lazy. And he was also busy apologizing for having been part of the Congress party during the emergency. So I used to really kick him on the backside and tell him कि थोड़ी देर के लिए भूल जाइए कि आप कांग्रेसी हैं, कविता को देखिए, कविता पर फोकस करिए, कांग्रेस पर मत फोकस करिए. सो ही सर तुम जानते नहीं हो कितनी मुश्किल होती है. ऐसे जनाब मैं जानती हूँ, मेरे फादर इन लॉ कैबिनेट सेक्रेटरी थे, तो मुझसे ज़्यादा इसके आँच किसने महसूस की है. अगर मैं कर सकती हूँ तो आप थोड़ा ध्यान नहीं दे सकते हैं क्या. So anyway, he did work very hard, and finally this, I think it was John Oliver Perry, someone, an American, I think. I have very vague memory of that particular period because so much was happening in my personal and literary life. He came to our house. We had several sittings with Shrikantji and Dr. Anant Murthy, and finally the anthology was ready. And when it was printed, I, of course, in the real way of translators, not given a copy, not sent a copy. So I again went out and searched these two culprits, Dr. Anant Murthy and Shrikantji, and I said, where is my copy? So they said, अच्छा हाँ तुमको नहीं मिली, वो limited copies छपी हैं. I said, what the hell? You haven't paid me a penny. I have put my head on the chopping block. And now you turn around, and after the thing is being written, they said, shh, हम भेज देंगे, चुपचाप भेज देंगे. So कहीं पिछवाड़े से, one day I suddenly discovered a copy. This was my introduction to the life of a translator. Much later, when I was an editor, several eminent economists, I will not name and shame them, contacted me about their really were excellent work on Indian economics and the economics of poverty. And they all requested, could their books be translated into Hindi? I said, yes, I have very good young people working for me. They would be very happy. And it would also be a very good thing for them to be exposed to this kind of a translation work. And but you must pay them well. Oh, yes, of course, we'll pay them individually. To date, none of those people have been paid. And I hang my head in shame. I paid some amount to them out of my own pocket to make up for the kind of, commuting and other work they must have done. But it's not a patch on what they really deserved. So I don't even know how people actually view Hindi translators of English books which are not literature, but technical, legal, on economy, on feminism, and so on. So it's a very grim scene for a young Hindi translator who may be good at the work, but if this kind of a thing repeats itself, then I really feel very, very upset about this. Because people say Hindi wale translate nahi karte hain. Now of course with the AI everybody is translating और इतने भयंकर translations हो रहे हैं. When I first agreed against my own good sense to allow one of my novels to be translated, in one of those there is a shair who's in love with a courtesan, and the courtesan is having an abdominal surgery and she is not expected to survive, so he sent her a last letter. पुराने ज़माने 19th century की बात है, when people used to write शेर व शायरी in these letters, and it's actually a real शेर from a real शायर who used to write theatre for Parsi theatre. And he said, तुझसे मिलने से पहले ओ मेरी जान मैं एक मतला था, तुझसे मिलने के बाद मैं एक शेर बन गया. तो AI ने उसको ट्रांसलेट किया कि my life before I met you, I felt sick all the time, मतली आ रही थी. After I met you, I turned into a lion. So this is your AI translation for you, and I am a witness and a sufferer. Of course, I threw that in the trash bin, and but that is what is happening. Of course, the Hindi authors, like authors anywhere, all of us are very keen that our work should be translated and it should go to a larger audience, and it has to be done. But who is doing it? How much do they know about the theme or the focus? In this particular book, there's a lot of focus on Indian classical music, late 19th century and late 18th century. And after it had been given to a certain translator, she confessed to me that she did not know about Indian classical music. So I said, कि तब तो कैसे लिखेगी? You know, the whole thing is based on conversations between musicians, musicologists, their own loves and affairs and their own lives and messed up upbringings and all that. And so in a way it meant rewriting, rewriting, and the end product is still not, very good. So if anybody asks me if they would like to translate me, I would think 20 times, at least not in my lifetime. Once I'm dead, then you can do what you like with it. But while I'm alive, I would not like to have the book handle. So people usually have, still in India, instead of all this Swadeshi and Falana Dhimaka, people still have work in linguistic hierarchies. Translating from Hindi to English is an upwardly mobile job. Translating from English to Hindi is a downwardly mobile job. And payments are made accordingly. You go to any major publisher, whether it is per page or per word, the translators into Hindi are paid much less than the translators who translate into English. Of course, the translators from English also come from a different social background and have a different social and economic clout, so they probably can argue face to face. But it's a very unfair world where daily living is concerned. I had a lot of young Hindi journalists working with me and in my team all through my life, 40, 50 years. And I tried to get them the best salaries that the house would give. They were never on par with the English language journalists working for the same house. For me, darwaze khule the. You name the figure and we'll sign it. I said, it's not about me. I don't really have not come to plead for myself, but I've come to plead for the fact that these are your multi-edition dailies circulating in millions, and you are paying these people these wages. So finally, anyway, this got sorted out when the TV stepped in and made Hindi a household name. TV programs became more popular, so salaries also began to rise. But the translation has still remained a bad area. It is still a very grey area in Mumbai. Some of my young colleagues tried their hand at writing film scripts or dialogues for Mumbai films, and they were very good. They were very good at their work, and these were very intelligent young people. And they said that everybody wanted everything in English. They wanted the script in English, the dialogues in English, And the dialogues had then to be translated into Roman Hindi so that the actors could deliver them, and that is why they deliver them so badly, and acting is so bad. So this is the dark underbelly of translation. It's very nice to hear people talking about, these are all very positive, very learned, very well educated people who have done excellent work, and one salutes them for their hard work and their intelligence. But at the same time, I think as an ex-editor, as an ex-quarrelsome old lady, not ex, I'm still a quarrelsome old lady, it is my duty to bring this out, that translation, payment for translations into Indian languages should be on par with translation from Indian languages into English. Most of the translators in this room, I presume, translate into English, but they can vouch for this. They can check with their counterparts who have translated from the same languages into Hindi, how poorly they are paid. So this was the first thing that I wanted to raise. And then just one more. I did serious translation in the sense in which it was being talked about for two books that I loved, and it was a sheer act of love, nothing else. The first was Maza Pravas by Godshe, by Vishnu Bhatt Godshe, a beggar from Konkan, North Konkan, from a village called Varsaikar. That was the area my ancestors came from. I was a Panth before I got married, and our ancestors had migrated early on in the 12th century from Konkan. This was a very poor area. This Brahman also vouches for that. Very poor area. So a lot of people migrated because either they incurred family, they had family weddings to perform, or their fields ran dry, or they had some other financial problem. So they came up north. So the same migration taking place, except that this uncle and nephew are two beggars. And then, in those days, Brahman vritti of begging was supposed to be kosher for Brahmins because they were so learned that they were expected not to put a stigma on anything they did. They went towards the north to meet the Maratha kings who were then ruling after the fragmentation of the Mughal rule, and they wanted to do some purohiti vritti there and then collect some money and then come back and pay back the money that they had taken from usurers. So these two Johnnies went there. It's the only perhaps eyewitness account of the 1857 Khadar in the north. These two Brahmins are extremely conservative, extremely traditional. They cook themselves, they wear one dhoti. The uncle and nephew are very poor but very upright and very conscious of the fact that they are learned Brahmins. They carry their almanacs and their books and everything. And then they travel and they face one trouble after another. And the desire to continue living and to save their lives and save their money. They do many things. And there's a frank confession of it. So much so that at one point they go to Lucknow. They end up in Lucknow in a bullock cart, and the nephew sends the uncle to sit with some older Brahmins and discuss religion, while he seeks out some younger company and goes to listen to Yavan Kanyas sing. Because he has heard that Yavan girls sing very well up in the north. So they go to Lucknow in search of these tabais. Then they come back to Ayodhya, and he does not refer to the Ram temple at all. So there was apparently no Ram temple. And he refers to other temples. He says there was a Kale Ramka temple and an old pujari who was also from the south. So they start talking about how bad the north is and how little the northern Pandits and Brahmins know about religion. So it was a wonderful voyage into the past for me, and I could still see the temperamental traits and the quirks that our family had. After so many centuries, some had gotten faded with time. So I translated this book and I gave it to Kartika at HarperCollins, and she was very pleased. and this book was immediately accepted in their perennials. Then she said, isn't there any other book you can think of which will beef it up? Because this is an eyewitness account written by a Sanskrit literate Brahmin who came back and then dictated it to a client of his who wrote it down but could not get it published for fear of reprisals. It was only after the man died he gave it to two printing presses to be published so that if one was burnt by the British, the other copy would survive. Finally, the book was published and they published it as a novel, Kadambari. So then again Marathi Satya Shodhan Sansthan after independence went around and picked up this book and said, hello, this is not a Kadambari. They had the original version available from the man's family who had it in custody. And then it was retranslated, and it was all these three versions which were made available to me by a friend. And then another friend gave me another translated Marathi version because the original was written in an older form of Marathi. And this in the Modi script. This was written in Devanagari script, so I could understand that. And then along with that, Manna from Heaven, I had a wonderful Hindi translation of the same book by Amritlal Nagar, a very close friend of my mother's, who had once come to our house and given this book to me in Hindi. And he said, he said, किसी दिन तुम अंग्रेजी जानती ना, किसी दिन तुम इसको अंग्रेजी में translate कर देना. So I did this. This was a pure gesture of love. Then everybody said that it has to have a twin. And I went on search and I realized that Amritlal Nagar had got a small fellowship from the government of UP in 1957 when the Gadar had completed a year. He undertook to go to all the villages in Avadh where Gadar had broken out and record the testimony of families whose ancestors were involved in it or who had seen what had happened. So, and he published it as a thin volume called Gadar Ke Phool, gathering the ashes of the 1857 Gadar. So I started translating it, but then I found that it was so intricate because he, being an Avadhi speaking man from the north, could understand the references and cross references the villagers were talking about. And to carry that into English was another task. So then I had to create an annexure, a kind of a go-to place where people who do not know Avadhi could find relatable words or introduction to the characters, dramatists, person being mentioned. The word Gadar, for example, one villager tells him, when 1857 Gadar happened, then this word came. Gadar meant, Gadar means plentiful, I think. And he said Gadar means जब सब बिखर जाता है. तो he said, "O ghar gaddaran ke aaye." Those are the houses in which the Gaddars who fought in the Gadar against the Indians for the British lived. So the word Gadar and Gaddar, seem to date back to at least in their present usage, seem to date back to almost 1857. So there were lots of things that were happening, and this is a very small kind of a needle in a haystack that you locate and somehow think that it is doing. But you find that translating is not just translating non-fiction, is not just rendering it in another language, it is also realizing how layered history is and how cruel history is. Also how loving history is, and also how ruthless and loving humankind is. And what is now happening is, history is being ironed into one shape, and one part is becoming all full of milk of human kindness, and the other half is being discarded as being too poisonous. And I think that's terrible, because in doing these two books, in translating these two books, I suddenly discovered various phases and facets of history and what it can do to the minds of the readers if they really read them in a good translation. And the rest, of course, is, in Hindi it's a poor scenario because a lot of books which are being translated into Hindi and becoming available to Hindi readers, I noticed at the World Book Fair, were bestsellers in English, not necessarily the best, the kind of writing that we have available in English, and a lot of how-to books, a lot of books on how to get rich quickly, how to learn about your religion in a capsule, how to learn about, being so and so. What I mean, what I want to really now call out for is layered translations and layered histories, and also various kinds of histories. Bhartendu Harishchandra wrote in the 19th century that there are at least 12 kinds of Hindis. Hindi from Avadh, Hindi from Mithila, Hindi from Bhojpur, and he said that there is also a Railway ki Hindi, which is laced with English words. So I think instead of becoming, what frightens me today is this this squashing of the smaller cultures and the smaller worlds, which are much more creative many ways than the main world that we now occupy. And these are being crushed, and before they can really blossom, children are being deprived of these languages and sent to English language tuitions. And I think unless the languages survive, a friend of mine once very beautifully captured it in an image. She said, when the coal miners enter a coal mine, they carry a canary on a stick. And if the canary is chirping, the mine is safe. The moment the canary dies, the mine is dead. And language is like that. Language is the canary that you carry with you. The moment it stops chirping, you know you are facing a dead literature. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Your work for the stringers that one happens to read in your last book, the news on foot soldiers who work out of teen chappers, how you stabilize their lives and career is also for the books. Thank you so much. With this, we break for a little coffee break, 15 minutes, and we'll try to come back in 15 minutes.
Yes, we should. Because
We
there are
must.
5 more speakers.
We must.
And we want to hear all of them.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.